And welcome to The Bottom Line, where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. Regional forecasts at the start of the year pointed to robust economic growth and recovery. As we wrap up 2024, those words don't come to mind anymore when it comes to the Central and Eastern European region. In order to grasp the significance and impacts of this, we are joined by Magdalena Polan, Head of Emerging Market Macroeconomic Research at PGIM. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So let's begin perhaps with first a bird's eye view analysis of Poland and its regional neighbors and their Q3 GDP results. Can we begin with who is doing best and why, and who is doing worst and why?
Well, it's difficult to say really who's doing really the best, because we should look just beyond the Q3 numbers that came quite mixed. But indeed, Poland is doing relatively well compared to the regional peers. You just showed the numbers before, and growth, although disappointing, it is still higher than in the rest of the region. And we have a couple of factors that may explain it. So on the one hand, on the domestic demand side, fiscal policy remains relatively more relaxed than in other countries, and I will come back to that topic later. And also, we saw some build-up in the inventories in Poland. Also, the drag on exports, even though it's not as deep as in the other countries, possibly thanks to a much more diversified structure of exports. So that's really helping the Polish economy, despite the certain slowdown in domestic demand. What's also really helping is that after a long period of conflict with the EU and the freezing of the part of the next generation RRF EU funds, Poland is finally receiving those, and they are being invested at a faster pace, which gives that extra leg up to the country. On the other end, you see countries like Hungary, where these funds remain frozen, together with part of the normal cohesion funds from the EU. And also, the government is really struggling to contain a fiscal deficit. And there is going to be a fiscal adjustment, fiscal tightening this year in Hungary. That means that creates a negative drag on growth. And even though the government is really trying very hard to control it, high cost of government debt means that practically the government is running in place just to stick to similar numbers. And the lack of EU funds, the need to tighten fiscal policy, reduce public expenditure, also means that the government is not investing as much as others might. And of course, the focus on car industry, a delayed pipeline in FDI investments is also putting some pressure on growth. And the rest of the countries, I think, are somewhat in between. Even those that used to grow quite fast, like Romania, are struggling a little bit given the gyrations in sentiment, external market environment, and also a little bit of that cycle of inventories that is particularly volatile after the Russian invasion on Ukraine. Also, as your program just before showed about, for example, the stocks of energy and gas and oil.
In terms of the Hungarian economy, which is in a technical recession, we've also seen that investment has dropped by almost 15%, the highest figure seen in 30 years. What comes next for Hungary?
Well, let's assume that the conflict with the EU is not resolved, and the EU money will not come to the country. That paints a rather difficult picture for the economy, and the private sector and the government will have to be the driving force for investments. We know that the government wants to do that, not only to revive growth, but also to improve sentiment ahead of the upcoming parliamentary elections in 2026. It's under quite strong pressure from the opposition, so I think this will be one of the very major aspects of economic policy for next year. How this may come about, we'll see, but there's not much space on the public balance sheet. Maybe a little bit of fiscal relaxation from the government side, but rather I think the government will try to incentivize the private sector to invest through, let's say, guarantees or a cheaper credit, and also possibly speeding up the substantial pipeline of foreign direct investments into Hungary, especially in the electric vehicles or battery. There's a lot of producers who want to locate their production in Hungary, but the pipeline is a little bit delayed, also due to the concerns about employment, availability of people, but also availability of energy. And I think your material just before pointed to that. Hungary is highly dependent, as a lot of other countries in Europe, still on Russian energy. And also it uses Russian technology to power its one nuclear power plant. And it needs to secure these sources to keep attracting foreign direct investment, restore investment in general, and then growth.
But at this stage, it looks like there is no easy way out for Hungary.
It is difficult. I agree, it is difficult, and it will take some clever policy making and possibly also lifting of sentiment. And that is the most difficult part. We're not only talking about sentiment being suppressed by the fear of conflict, uncertainty over the future of the industry, especially car industry, Europe in general. And I think that also affects sentiment in Poland and other countries, Slovakia, across this region. But also as we face the new US administration that potentially changes some of the key aspects of the US policy and also how the global markets function, with Hungary being particularly sensitive to the sentiment in the global markets, it is not an easy fix for the Hungarian policymakers to turn the ship around, maybe minimize damage, give a little bit more of boost, but I don't think a very large turnaround is easily possible within a year or a year and a half.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Czech economy and the Slovakian one. So just very briefly, what is getting in the way of the Czech economy just surging just that little bit more? And also Slovakia, I'll just ask you in one question. We've seen the Slovak economy, it's growing, but it's slow and low, just to put it in a brief phrase. If you could just tell us a little bit more about those two economies.
So one thing is sentiment, the other one is fiscal policy, and the third one is export structure and strong connection to Germany. So let's start with sentiment and Germany together, because as you know very well, the German economy is really in a difficult position. There is a lot of rethink going on about the future of Germany. Sentiment is weak, but also especially the car industry is not doing well. And both Czech Republic and Slovakia are deeply connected and integrated with that part of the German economy. If Germany is not doing well, if car exports are not doing well, Czech Republic, Slovakia will not do well. That also then translates into sentiment, right? So that weighs on the expectations, willingness to spend, willingness to invest. Then when we talk about fiscal policy, this is something that really will affect or is already affecting a lot of economies. Slovakia needs to tighten its budget deficit. Czech Republic is also tightening its deficit to a small degree, but that weighs on domestic demand and can create these feedback loops between sentiment, spending, and demand, and then finally growth. So all this is a little bit of that negative equilibrium that these countries find themselves in, and especially more so because they are so much smaller compared to the larger countries in the region, such as Poland, let's say, or even Romania.
I wanted to ask you about this next significant crossroad for the region, and it is the Trump tariffs. There is this sentiment, should we say, or perhaps this positive hope that next year will be better for the region. But essentially, this is working on the assumption that things will improve, or they at least won't get much worse in Germany, and that somehow the region will be able to cope with the Trump tariffs. Can you give us a little bit of insight on how you perceive the beginning of next year to work out, shall we say, hopefully work out for the region?
So let's start with the recovery and the year being better. Indeed, we do expect that there will be some turnaround in the German activity, and then some of the worst of that slump and the sentiment is behind us. And maybe also the new German government can breathe a fresh breath of air and optimism into the German economy and the German businesses. And let's say, despite this slowdown in Germany, the smaller European economies are still doing well. aside from the Hungarian fiscal and other problems, these countries are still managing to grow to some extent. So it's not complete, the region is not completely being dragged down. But yes, the potential tariffs from the US, and let's assume, because things are not very certain yet, let's assume there is a wide 10% tariff on all imports coming to the US and higher tariffs on China specifically. But let's say there is that wide tariff coming on anything coming to the US. That will affect Europe. Europe is a big exporter. US is a big destination. That is more important for countries like Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium. For countries in the region, this is a little bit more of an indirect effect, because they, of course, export more to Germany, more to these large European economies, and that indirectly goes to the US. So it's a bit less painful. But if there is also a strong tariff on China, and China competes with Europe on many products, including cars, that can feed back into the European economies, it should be probably negative for currencies, possibly negative for growth, and then we'll see, but possibly also deflationary or disinflationary, given the potential inflow of cheaper Chinese goods into the markets. But then we're coming into a trade conflict area, which is probably a somewhat different game. But again, high degree of uncertainty, given that we don't really know yet exactly where the US wants to go.
Okay, Magdalena Polan, always great to have you with us. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you so much.
And that was Magdalena Polan, Head of Emerging Market Macroeconomic Research at PGIM. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us again tomorrow for Business Arena at 5 p.m. CET on TVP World. And for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and features, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.